Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. As we let people in, if you don't mind putting what city you're joining us from in the chat, it's great to see where lots of people are coming from. So just the city that you're joining us from today in the chat would be helpful. If you just, sorry, go ahead.
Chat is disabled.
Oh. Okay, thanks everyone for letting us know chat is disabled. We're working on it now.
Let's see if that works, Gina.
Okay, can you try putting where you're from in the chat? Let's see if it's working. Yeah, I can see it now. Thank you. Awesome. We have Carson, California, Sacramento, Fairbanks, Alaska. Awesome. Welcome. San Francisco, Roseville, Compton, Monterey Park, Antioch, Washington, D.C., Hollister, San Diego, Orange County, Santa Ana, Oakhurst, San Francisco, Sacramento, Compton, Santa Rosa, Los Angeles, Roseville, Rancho Cucamonga, Long Beach. Wow, Spokane, Washington. People from all over. Hi, Rommel. Nice to see you. Tulare, Norwalk, Woodland, North Hollywood, Ontario. Wow, we really have big representation from the state today. Riverside, Morgan Hill, San Juan, Puerto Rico. Awesome. Covina, Ventura, Ottawa, Springfield, Illinois. Wow, lots of people from all over. So great to see so many people here today. We do have a full training, so we're just going to wait another minute or two to let people in. We're near 100 now. We have about 200 people joining us. So just another minute or two and we'll get started. More from Los Angeles. Welcome. I'm going to make sure everybody's in the right place today. This is the trauma and violence training, how disrupting the cycle of violence provides safety for everyone. I'm Dr. Gina Castro Rodriguez, the survivor of the Policy Training and Resource Center. And we'll also have Arcelio Hurtado, the Director of Policy and Training, presenting with us today. Okay, we're at about 3 minutes after, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Great, so thank you for joining us today for our training. This is part of our Survivor Center training series. There will be MCLE credits for today. So that's kind of rare for the Survivor Center trainings, but this training is going to have some real application for prosecutors in it, as well as information about how violence is developed and sustained and demonstrated. One of the reasons I wrote this training, and I'll be doing some more trainings and research on this in the next year, is that trauma presents for kids and really is so foundational and disruptive to their development that we see long-term big implications, personal interpersonal implications, as well as external implications, including violence. And as hard as that is to hear about, and today's training may be hard for some of you to hear some of the things that people go through that are very difficult, maybe some things that you've gone through yourself. The reason I find studying this hopeful is that we can do something about it. And when we start to address bad things that happen to people, particularly to children, we prevent violence and harm in the future. And so I really like this topic. I really think that it's going to be part of the solution to ending violence, and it's going to take a lot of work. And so today we're going to talk about a lot of the foundation of that. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Before we start with this training, I just want to let you know that for December, we had another training plan for the Survivor Center training series. And instead, we decided to repeat some of the most popular trainings. I get a lot of emails and requests from you all to either get access to the videos or to repeat these trainings. So that's what we're going to do in December. So on December 5th, for Pacific Standard Time, we'll be doing a repeat of all of these trainings. So from 10:30 to 11, we'll be doing the one on victims' rights with the California Victims Compensation Board. So if you recall this training, or if you saw the ad for it, we talk a lot about how to access, what are victims' rights. Oh, I'm sorry. This one is actually with the 1-800-VICTIMS with Miriam El-Mashawi. This is about victims' rights and learning about Marcy's rights in California and how to help both invoke those and implement them for victims of crime. The second one from 11:30 a.m. to 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time will be on stalking. And this is with the National Stalking Center. And it's a lot about prosecuting stalking cases, supporting survivors in stalking cases, and just understanding what the breadth of stalking activity is. And then from 1 to 2:30 p.m., we'll be doing the California Victims Compensation training with the California Victims Compensation Board. And you'll get lots of questions answered about how to access victims compensation, what it covers, how to help someone apply for it, and what the process is. And then the final one from 2:30 to 4 p.m. is neurobiology of sexual trauma. This is a training that I've done many times for prosecutors and law enforcement, and it helps understand what happens to a person who's been the victim of a sexual trauma in the moments surrounding that trauma, but also in the days and the weeks following, and how to work with them as survivors to both support them in healing and recovery and in cases that you're working on. So this repeat, I will show this again at the end of the presentation. So you can point your phone at it and go to the QR code and register for it. If you're already registered for the full series, you will get a notice about it, and I'll be amending the training there for the time so that you'll be able to see this. And then when you get this PowerPoint at the end of this week, you'll have the link there to register. So yes, you will get the PowerPoint from today's training. I usually send those out on Friday. If you have registered and attended the training, you will get a link to that. All right, let's go ahead and get started on the agenda and what we're going to talk about today. We're at about 122 people right now. Let's talk about trauma today. We're going to start with what kinds of trauma affect people the most. And so the two that are really important when we're talking about violence are generational trauma and childhood trauma. And I'll talk about why, but those are foundational traumas that actually frame the way we think and we behave. And that's why it affects violence in the future. The second thing we're going to talk about is risk factors for violence. So not all of us are at the same risk to commit violence. There are certain times in our lives when we are more at risk, and we're going to focus in on adolescence and young adulthood and why that makes us more vulnerable during that time. And then we're going to talk about understanding trauma itself. Violence itself. What is the neurobiology behind trauma? What's happening in our brain when we have violence and trauma? And then also, what are the components that come together to create violence? Then we'll talk about treating violence and public safety. What do we need to do to shift the paradigm so that we are directing resources and services in a way that prevent future violence? And then we'll talk about the role of the prosecutor and things you can do as a prosecutor or as a victim advocate to support your victims and survivors of gun violence. All right, so let's get started with trauma first. So If you've been through my trainings before, you know I like to start with everyone being on the same page about what trauma is. We've learned a lot about traumatology in the last 30 to 40 years, but some of it is misunderstood. So trauma is actually very significant. It has to be something very big. It's not being disappointed. It's not being let down. It's not being emotionally hurt most of the time. It has to be very significant. Life or death threatening an event, or an event where you were unable to protect yourself directly or indirectly from some kind of harm. So think about either you were the victim of violence or you were threatened with violence so significantly that you believed it was going to happen, or you saw someone who also was a victim of violence that you cared about or that you love be harmed by violence. And then the not being able to protect yourself, a sad but good example of that would be like sexual assault or a physical assault, where you couldn't maintain your own physical integrity. Somebody actually violated you. So the important things about trauma, it can be direct or indirect. So it can happen directly to you, or it can happen in front of you or to someone that you care about or that you depend on. So for children, this is really important because children depend on adults to take care of them, to protect them, to keep them safe, to keep them alive. And so when the adults around them are harmed, it has a very significant impact. So this is why if we have a child who loses a parent to gun violence, it can have significant trauma for that child, even though they were not the direct target of that harm. So direct or indirect. The second one is chronic or complex. So the biggest predictor of whether or not you will be a victim of crime is if you have been a victim of crime in the past. So your own victimization, whether it was in childhood or as an adult, is actually what predicts your continued risk for becoming a victim. And so that's really important for us to know, because we often have children who've experienced violence and we don't know that, and then they have more violence later in their future. Complex trauma is when the trauma happens by someone who is in a caregiving or parental role. So someone that was supposed to love and take care of you or keep you safe either caused the harm or did not protect you. And that protection could be willful or unwillful. They neglected you and were not there for you to keep you safe, or maybe they had to work several jobs, or they were away from the family, or they were struggling with their own substance abuse or mental health issues. We're going to talk about generational trauma in a few minutes, but it doesn't matter how that happens. It's the fact that the child was not protected by someone that was supposed to love and take care of them that causes the complexity to the trauma. And the issue with complex trauma is that it is much more difficult to treat than single incidents of trauma. So we actually have a lot of really good strategies in the clinical world to treat single incidences of trauma. If you are a sudden victim of crime or a sudden victim of a car accident or a traumatic event, we have lots of things that can help you overcome the symptomology associated with that incident. But when you have layers of trauma, it is complex. It includes layers of betrayal and layers of being kept unsafe. Then that trauma serves to integrate into the person, and really they will function with lessons from that trauma. So trauma teaches us a lot of lessons about the world, about ourselves, about others. And so that kind of complex trauma has a lot of long-lasting effects.
Gina, there's a question in the Q&A, and maybe you will address this later, but someone, Rodrigo de Avila, wants to know, can you talk about how trauma can affect memory?
Thank you, Rodrigo. I actually won't touch too much on that one, but in this training, but if you are interested in it, the training on working with sexual assault survivors goes all into how trauma affects and disrupts memory. I don't go into it too much in this training. I'll try to touch on it when we get to the brain, though. Thank you. And then the last qualifier, is it single or multiple incidences of trauma? So did one thing happen, or has many things happened to this person, this family, this community? And when we have multiple things happening to people, we build layers to the trauma, and we also have the capacity to re-trigger other traumas. So it's not just what's going on in the present that is being presented as the trauma reaction. It's actually the past that is building and being presented. So with time, the reactions get bigger and bigger and bigger with this kind of trauma. I put PTSD in here because this is a really common diagnosis that we hear about, but fortunately, it's actually not that common in the general population. Less than 15% of people who experience a trauma will develop the symptomology for PTSD. That's the good news. Most people survive really difficult things. The challenges are in those qualifiers up above, when it is directly towards the person, when it is chronic and complex, and when it happens in multiple incidences. And that's where we tend to see diagnosis of PTSD. So the symptoms of PTSD are these 4 categories. The first is avoidance. So avoiding sometimes things that remind you of the trauma itself because you're preventing the re-triggering. But for kids, it sometimes looks like they stop doing the things that they used to like to do, the activities, the events, the people they used to connect with. They start to isolate and not connect with those people anymore. Re-experiencing for most adults, that looks like re-experiencing looks like flashbacks. And flashbacks are not just memories, they're actually the body responding to the memory again, as if you are in danger, even though you're not physically in danger anymore. So it's a really debilitating symptom that happens for people. You could be sitting at work, be completely physically safe, and all of a sudden your body and mind respond as if you are in acute danger. So this is a panic attack, or this is, ruminating thoughts, or this is anxiety, and it disrupts your regular life. For kids, because they don't often understand or have a lot of context for what happened, much of that processing might happen in their sleep. And so they might have nightmares, no longer be able to sleep by themselves, want to sleep with a light on, want to sleep with someone else. Those are the kinds of things that happen for them. The third symptom is hypervigilance. So this is sort of that fidgety anxiety that we have, shaking your foot, tapping your fingers on the table, inability to sit down and stay in one place. For kids, though, because the majority of their time is spent in school, this could look like behavior and learning problems when it's not. So they can't stay in their seat. They can't follow directions. They have a hard time staying on task. They struggle with playing games with rules or playing with friends and following order around any kind of activity. And that could be from the trauma. And then the last one is mood. And so we see either presentations of anxiety or depression or both. And so anxiety is worry about the future, things that could happen, and depression is worry about the past, things that have already happened. And often with PTSD, we see a combination of both of those. All right, let's talk a little bit about intergenerational trauma, because this isn't discussed enough. The first is that we know trauma is generational, that it's actually passed down in multiple ways. There's a marker on DNA that changes when somebody experiences trauma. We can actually identify a strand of DNA that loses part of its protective telomeres when somebody has experienced trauma. And that means that the next generation will have DNA without those protective telomeres on them. And that doesn't mean that they are prone to have trauma, but it means if they do experience trauma, their responses will be bigger and more pronounced than the generation before them. We also know that you can biologically pass down the implications of stress, like during pregnancy. When you have a stressful pregnancy, when you have trauma during pregnancy, our stress hormones are circulating through our body, and they also circulate through the body of the fetus, which dysregulates the fetus's symptoms. And then also just the way that we interact and behave when we've experienced trauma changes, the way we see ourselves, others, and the world, and that impacts children and people around us. So generational trauma is when parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, our ancestors have experienced and or witnessed traumatic events. And then they pass on dysfunctional, unhealthy, often unspoken and deeply complex wounds. And those wounds present as views or family narratives, so lessons that the family carries on about each other. So things like, we're on our own, we can't trust other people, don't trust the government, the family itself are the only ones that can rely on each other. The culture, the community can only rely on each other. Certain people are dangerous, certain people are safe. That's the family views and narratives that get passed down from those very real experiences. And then that sets up the next generation to hold those values, those views, those narratives as the fact, right? The second is in parenting. So those symptomologies that we talked about with trauma can actually be passed down because the parent has to respond to their trauma in ways to protect themselves, to prevent the re-triggering or to avoid the symptomology that is going to make them feel bad. And so, maybe they do things like, they don't let you go and stay at someone else's house, or you're not allowed to be out on the street with your friends playing, or you can only play with people that you're related to, or those are some of the trauma lessons that someone learns in their own trauma. And then in their parenting, they display it and pass it down as a way to protect their children, but it narrows their children's lives, and that will also affect the next generation. We also have behaviors, bias, and messaging that come out of trauma. So because those traumas teach us such big lessons, they also frame the way we think about the future. And so often we will internalize those messages as fact instead of feeling. This is what happened, so this is what I know about the world now. And they may be true in some instances, but they may also not be true in some instances. And so when we get into that black and white thinking, we narrow the world for people. We make it more small and confined. And that's what anxiety does. The fear of things make our world very small. And then the last one is maladaptive coping mechanisms, including aggression. And so sometimes the way that we manage preventing trauma to happening again in our lives is to push people away from us, or to hurt people before they hurt us, or to, use violence to control other people's behavior so that they don't harm us. And those are all lessons that come out of this generations of trauma. The idea that you have to protect yourself and don't let anyone hurt you might mean that you have to hurt someone else first so that doesn't happen. So these are the kinds of narratives that gets passed down in generational trauma. The hard thing about generational trauma is that it makes the next generation more vulnerable to trauma symptoms, including PTSD, because they're already heightened when they experience their own difficult, challenging, and traumatic events. And then because of those biological connections that I talked about with DNA and other biological processes, they are already prone to respond to trauma in a more heightened way. And so it's not that more people have PTSD now. It is really that the PTSD is getting stronger for people, or the trauma reactions are getting stronger for people over generations. And we're getting better at diagnosing it and understanding it. So we're seeing it more, but trauma has been around since the beginning of time. I also want to talk a little bit about historical trauma, because this really affects a lot of people of color. It's closely related to generational trauma, but it involves trauma experienced by specific cultural, racial, or ethnic groups. So these are usually something that happened to an entire population. So think about genocide of Native Americans that happened to most Native Americans around the same time period. Colonization happened to people all over the world. Slavery in this country and in other countries, where a whole group of people are affected by a trauma. The Holocaust and multiple Holocausts over time, but certainly the Holocaust for Jewish people before and during World War II had a huge impact on Jewish people. Internment, like the internment camps we had here for Japanese Americans, also could be related to a religious group. So these are traumas that happen to large groups of people. And even if a person was not directly affected by it, they may be affected by the trauma because the learning from that trauma is passed down to their people, right? Maybe it affected an aunt or an uncle or an ancestor, a grandparent, a relative, and then that becomes the knowledge of that family, the lessons learned from that family, and it projects in the next generation and the next generation. Are there any questions so far? Okay, I don't see anything in the chat. Great. All right. So let's talk about some important times when trauma affects people. The first is childhood. So why is childhood trauma so important? The main reason is that when trauma happens to a child, they are completely dependent on the adults to protect them, so they can't protect themselves. They don't have agency, they don't have power, they don't have rights. So they don't control who they're exposed to, where they get to go, how safe their home is, who interacts with them. And because of those things, it makes them more vulnerable. The second thing is that when trauma happens to a child during childhood, it happens during their development. They are still developing and growing. And so that trauma doesn't affect them in that moment. That trauma actually changes the course of their development. So if you're a pretty well put together adult, you can sustain really difficult things. And the way that you do that is you use all of those coping mechanisms that are allowing you to be a pretty well put together adult, allowing you to work and go to school and have colleagues and friends and romantic relationships and engage in the community. You would use all of those mechanisms to help you heal from significant events. It may take time. It may have a lot of damage. It may harm you, but you will recover because you have those capacities already there. Children don't have those capacities yet. So they borrow the capacities of the people around them. And when we have generational trauma, generations of people who have been harmed by trauma, they have less and less capacity to manage that trauma. And now they don't have what they need to help that generation get through that trauma. Or unfortunately, they may have even caused that trauma themselves because of the things that they didn't get or the expressions of their own violence that I'm going to talk about. So kids are especially vulnerable to trauma and the effects of trauma. So there's a very famous study that I know most of you have heard about, but I'm going to talk about it a little bit for those who haven't. It's called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. It was done by Kaiser, a doctor named Dr. Vince Felitti in Kaiser, over 20 years ago now, who wanted to study what he saw as a correlation between the patients he was treating for chronic illnesses, mostly related to obesity, and traumatic experiences they were talking about in their childhood. And what he found in his investigation is that not only was there a correlation between those two issues, but there's actually a causation factor, which means that when you have those experiences in your childhood, the more of them you have, the more negative health and social outcomes you have later in life. And this was a really important foundational study in the late 90s because it helped us understand that violence is a public health issue. It's not just an issue around crime or around violence. It's also a public health issue. And so in his study, he asked if these things had happened when the adult subjects were children, things like physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, witnessing domestic violence, parental substance abuse, mental health issues for parents, suicide, criminal behavior, or being removed from the family in some way. He saw these as the most profound sort of experiences that kids might witness as children. Some things that were left out in this study, but we're now looking at include community violence, generational trauma, historical trauma. We're starting to understand the implications of those as well.
Gina, there's a question in the chat.
Great.
What does research show about trauma resulting from watching scary movies, porn, violence in neighborhood or streets?
Actually, it's very mixed and not very strong. So let's start with watching things flatly. In general, viewing something does not contribute to someone being violent. It can exacerbate or feed someone's violence if they already have experienced trauma and are violent, but it typically doesn't ignite violence. And then for watching violence in the street, that can have an effect. So because what it does is it'll ignite the system, our stress response system, because we are in some sort of danger. It's happening around us. It's happening in real life. It's happening in our neighborhood. We see it over and over again. It's called toxic stress. I'm going to talk about it on the next slide. But toxic stress does put us at risk for not just being the perpetrator of violence, but also being the victim of violence in the future. So I'll get to that in a minute. That's a great question. So what we found was that these traumas that happen to people, generational trauma, societal conditions like things happening in our community, wars, violence in the community, gun violence, those kinds of things, and as well as these individual interpersonal experiences, the ACEs, the adverse child experiences, are sort of the foundation of building the traumatic response that happens for children that causes the later poor outcomes. And those things are disrupted neurodevelopment. I'm going to talk about the brain in a moment and how the brain is affected by violence and trauma. Societal, cognitive impairment, emotional impairment. So that's about the behaviors that people exhibit because they've experienced trauma. Adoption of risky behaviors or maladaptive coping mechanisms. So things like using substances and alcohol and food and sex and gambling and things to mitigate the pain that someone feels. Also, violence is another poor coping mechanism. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. And then those things lead to disease, disability, and social problems. So things like increased heart disease, increased lung disease, increased cancers, increased inflammatory diseases, high blood pressure, emphysema, diabetes. These are all tied to this traumatic stress response that some people and some groups of people experience in much higher levels. And then societal issues, we get increased rates, sometimes 4 to 10 time fold for suicidality, self-harm behavior, substance use. These things are much higher for people who have experienced trauma generationally and in their own childhood. And ultimately, what this accounts for is lots of illness and early death. And so we see early death in people who have experienced a lot of trauma. And when I get to the HPA axis, I'll talk about why. Oh, here it is right now. All right. So there's 2 very important systems that we have to deal with. First is the limbic system, and that's the emotional center of our brain. And the emotional center of our brain is always taking in information, processing it, and putting it into long-term memory, except when it's experiencing trauma. So our limbic system, our limbic cortex, affects our mood. It's reading information from the environment and it's affecting how we feel, right? Are we happy? Are we sad? Are we excited? Are we worried? It's giving us the messages about how we feel. And then the hippocampus, that piece that someone asked about, is actually the part of the brain that categorizes information that we take in. What do we see, feel, hear, smell, taste? And categorizes it so that it can go into long-term memory. So what did we just experience out in the world? And what pockets or files do we put that in? And then we send it to long-term memory so that later we can recall it. If I asked you right now to think about your 12th birthday, it might take you a few minutes, but hopefully if that wasn't a traumatic event, you would be able to recall some of the details around your 12th birthday relatively easily with some clarity, maybe where you were, what you did, who a friend was, because it's not traumatic information. It went in a regular process. And then there's 2 other big pieces that are important, the hypothalamus and the amygdala. The amygdala tells us what our emotions are, like fear and anxiety. It sort of reads danger out in that environment, and it's constantly scanning the environment to protect us. Is there something dangerous happening? Is there some signal that we need to see? Often we talk about these like red flags. Is there something that you see that might feel dangerous? Now, if someone hasn't experienced a lot of trauma, that amygdala works pretty well to detect danger out in the world. When you have been harmed by trauma, unfortunately, that amygdala starts to dull and lessen, and it doesn't do such a good job of predicting danger out in the world. And that's one of the things that we think is tied to why victims of crime or victims of abuse end up being victims of multiple kinds of crime and abuse. It's because that sensor for detecting danger in lots of ways gets dulled. And then the last one is the hypothalamus. And this is the one that's connected to that physical response, the illness that we see, the disease that we see, the societal issues like suicidality and substance abuse. The hypothalamus, really affects our whole body, our limbic output. So it's about giving messages to our whole body. And so a stress response that we have affects our entire body. And so the chemicals that are released during a stress response flood our body, and then they will come out of our body within around 30 minutes to 96 hours, depending on how severe the scare or the fear or the incident was. But while they are circulating through our body, they're affecting every one of our organs. And when they circulate out, they don't completely come out because they store in our fat cells. And so the more you're exposed to trauma or your body creates that trauma response over and over again, the more damage those chemicals are causing. And that's how we see that long-term damage later on. So a really important mechanism in our body is called the HPA axis, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal gland axis. We know it commonly as fight or flight. So fight or flight, and we won't talk about fawn today because that's another part of it, or freeze, but fight or flight is a stress response. Every single one of us has it. We do it to protect ourselves, right? The hypothalamus is out there scanning the information that the amygdala is sending. It is seen when there is danger, and it's going to tell the body, get ready. There's something dangerous here. We need to protect ourselves. And the way it does that is it tells the pituitary to send chemicals and proteins, sugars, cortisol, noradrenaline, and adrenaline through our body so that we can act, right? We can run, we can fight, we can move something out of the way, we can have the strength and the capacity to protect ourselves. So that system activates. All the messages get sent. All the blood rushes to our extremities. The sugar gives us the energy. The other parts of our body that we don't need right now, like the capacity to eliminate waste or digest food or even take in and process memories correctly, they all shut down so that we can focus on survival, getting out of there alive. When we are really in danger, and there's something very serious happening to us, this is a life-saving mechanism. It allows us to protect ourselves and stay alive. The problem is when this system gets activated over and over and over again because someone in your home is causing the harm, or someone in your family is causing the harm, or someone in your neighborhood is causing the harm, this system gets dysregulated and starts to activate on its own, even when you're not in danger. So this is what happens when we have that re-experiencing. Someone is sitting at work and their body feels like they're in danger and activates, or someone is at school trying to take a math test and their body believes they're in danger and it activates. And those chemicals rush through our body again as if we're in danger. That should happen rarely, but instead it's flooding our body with these chemicals that are really toxic, particularly to children who are developing. Their brains are developing, their organs are developing, their bodies developing, their muscles, their bones. And so it is not just affecting them in that moment, it's affecting them in the future because it's changing their development. So the system that should be adaptive and healthy and life-saving actually starts to harm us when it's activated too much or in the wrong way. All right, so let's talk about what kids go through, the impacts of trauma. The first is that presentation of depression. So when something bad has happened, we often can't stop thinking about it. We have thoughts about it. We can't stop remembering it, particularly if our body is remembering it, then we can't stop remembering it. Toxic stress is when bad things happen over and over again, and our body is activated by that. So think about child abuse or child neglect, sexual abuse, those kinds of things that are not one-time events, but happen over and over a period of time to children. It creates a stress environment where the body has to keep responding to it, which is not what should be happening. The next thing that develops is fears and worries. Often presents as anxiety. So fears and worries start to close our world in, right? When we're afraid of things or we're worried that something is going to re-trigger or make us feel bad or put us in harm's way, our world starts to get smaller and smaller. And the biggest effect of this is isolation and avoidance. So starting to make that world smaller and smaller. This is what we see in the generational trauma, where someone has learned a lesson about trauma. So they try to make the world smaller to protect someone, but they're also making the world smaller so that they're not enjoying the things that are out there too. Aggression is another presentation of trauma. So aggression and anger are just manifestations of trauma. Doesn't mean they're good, doesn't mean they're okay, but they are a presentation of trauma, and they can happen when someone has been harmed and was not able to protect themselves. Now they're doing everything they can, their body is doing everything they can to protect them from being harmed again. We can see low self-esteem. We can see that diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder if somebody has persistent existence of those symptomology that we talked about. And then we even see self-destructive behaviors. So the pain from trauma can either go inward, where we see someone ruminate with thoughts, suffer with depression and anxiety, self-destructive behaviors, do things to sort of manage those feelings like substance abuse and alcoholism, or we can see external expressions. That's violence, that's aggression, that's preventing someone from harming them before they get harmed, or a combination of the two. So we will often see those as a display of someone who's experienced trauma. So let's talk about who's most at risk, because not everyone is at the same risk. So the biggest one is children. Children are at big risk because when they have that toxic stress, that prolonged and repeated stress, that body is activating over and over again, that stress response system. It's not supposed to do that. It wasn't meant to do that. And so that the presentation of those chemicals and proteins that are happening are actually changing the biochemistry of the child and putting the child in danger of, social, emotional, and physical ailments in the future this is without any kind of knowledge about what's happening. This is just happening in their bodies. It's also without intervention, because with intervention, we can slow or stop the progression of this disease, but we don't do a very good job at treating child abuse or treating violence, particularly for children. If you're a victim advocate, I know that you probably have not provided connection to treatment for many children. It's very hard to get children into treatment because they require parental support and parental engagement in order to do that. And then just finding services for children that are accessible and, adaptable and in languages that people need them in and in places where people need them is really challenging. We have a mental health crisis right now for children, and we're not able to get them the kinds of mental health resources that they need. So it's a very hard thing to treat right now. And then trauma, neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, exposure to violence, those things that repeat, they're not typically a one-time incident. Those feed this toxic stress and they prolong it, which does more damage as the child continues to develop. The second big risk factor or group that has risk is adolescents and young adults. And that's actually because of what's normally happening during their development at this time. So during regular, normal adolescence without the presence of trauma, this is already a time of emotional processing where their emotions are heightened and intensified. That's because the part of the brain that is most developed at this time period is the limbic system, the emotional center of the brain. And so that part of the brain is working really well for them, and they're experiencing those highs and lows. They also have some biochemical changes that are happening in their body, some physiological changes that are heightening that, but they're very emotional during this time. You may remember this as an emotional time for yourself, or if you have adolescents, you know that their emotions can swing during this time period. Also, social engagement is the driver that pushes them away from their parents. This is supposed to happen. But what it means is that their friends start to be more important than their parents. They start to have a bigger influence than their parents. And that's because they're supposed to be individuating from the parent. But the thing that's filling that space is their peers. And so their peers are going to start to have a big influence. If their peers are positive, that's great. If their peers are not positive, then we have a lot of young people that are sort of struggling together without information, guidance, and support. Peer pressure makes them forsake morality for membership. So they'll do things for their friends that they wouldn't do for other people. They'll take huge risks for their friends. They will cover for their friends. They will protect their friends. That's all normal. It's part of the bonding process, but it can be dangerous when there's risk associated with it. And the need for novelty and excitement is really high during this time. So the dopamine levels in their brain have actually shifted in adolescence. They've dropped really low on a regular basis. This is why we see the onset of depression. This is why we see, that sort of like bored presentation from teenagers. They'll tell you that everything's boring and they don't have anything to do and everything kind of sucks and their town doesn't have anything to do, those kinds of things. That's because their normal dopamine has dropped. It will come back later on its own, but during adolescence, it's pretty low. But the benefit that they get during that time period is that when they do have an emotion, they are excited, they're angry, they fall in love, they are scared. Those emotions are higher than any other time in their life. And they will have big presentations of dopamine when those activities happen. So they're sort of riding a roller coaster during these adolescent years, which most kids tolerate. But the more things they're exposed to that are dangerous and the more situations they're put into that are dangerous, this heightenedness will be a detriment to them. And we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. And then the last time is it's supposed to be a time for creative exploration, allowing them to challenge the status quo, rules, boundaries. This is when people are the most creative that you'll ever be in your life. So up until about the age 25, this is when we have lots and lots of creativity. We take risks that we wouldn't take. We try things that we wouldn't do. You know, both environmentally, we don't have the same kind of responsibilities and we don't have the same obligations. And so we can do more things, but also physically, we have the capacity to do things that we couldn't do when we're in our adulthood. So, you know, maybe you can think back to something you did when you were 15 or 16 years old that you wouldn't do now because it wouldn't be safe or it'd be too dangerous or too risky. So let's talk a little bit about adolescent brain development, because this one is really misunderstood. I think a little bit of information without a lot of follow-up has led people to misinterpret what this means. So it doesn't mean that the up to 25, you have a child's brain. That's not what that means at all. What happens is that the brain develops just like the body develops slowly, right? A 2-year-old looks different than a 3-year-old, than a 4-year-old, than a 5-year-old, then so on. The brain is the same thing. The brain is developing more capacity as we get older, up until about 25, and then it doesn't flatten or end. You continue to grow just at a much slower rate. So that's why you can go back and get another degree or learn a new job. You can actually learn all the way until your last breath. Our brain will keep adapting and learning. So there's not less capacity when you're a young adult or an adolescent. There's different capacity. So let's talk about the places where there's some different capacity. One of them is the prefrontal cortex. We hear a lot about this, right? Because this is the executive functioning part of the brain, the part of our brain that makes decisions and set goals and weighs consequences and thinks about outcomes and starts and stops behavior and tempers our emotions and our reactions. This is a really important part of the brain for what we call adult thinking, right? So adolescents do have capacity to access this. The challenge is that the better they have been modeled and protected and taken care of, the better functioning this part of their brain will be. And the more things that have caused damage or disruption or dysfunction to the brain, like trauma, like abuse, like violence, the harder it will be for this part of the brain to work effectively. So it's not fully integrated with the rest of the brain yet. That's the development that's still happening, but it still can connect and work. This is why not every 19-year-old is committing violence, but some are, because they are still developing this part of their brain and they've been exposed to things that have disrupted that cycle, right? The amygdala is really important. That's that emotional regulation part of our brain. That's sort of dysregulated during adolescence, which is normal. We talked about that. They have really high highs, they have really low lows. That's okay, except if they are at risk for harming other people or being harmed, right? Because if they have the safety of people protecting them and they have these big emotions, then they'll survive them and they'll continue to get more integrated with time as they get older. But if they don't have that protection and that safety and security, then they can react and respond to those emotions. So they need the front part of the brain, that prefrontal cortex, to regulate those emotions. And because those are not working that well, this is what we do in parenting, right? They get mad and they fly off the handle and we say, you can't do that and you're grounded now. And so we are regulating their brain, right? But if they don't have that kind of parenting, if they don't have that kind of support, then that brain will just respond. So most adolescents and young adults are working on improving the capacity to feel something and do something. They feel something and they want to do something. Think about a toddler in a grocery store. They want a candy, you say no, and so they have a tantrum. Okay, that's a little bit on this side of the spectrum for development. But when we get to adolescence, they feel something and they will often say something or do something. And then we get to young adulthood and they feel something and they say something or do something, and the stakes get higher and higher, especially if they have access to things that make those stakes higher. So that's why these two pieces of the brain that are still developing are really important. We need that protection while they're starting to integrate tighter and tighter. Doesn't mean they don't have capacity. It just means that it's integrating tighter. And then the last one that's affected is that hippocampus, that part of the memory. When the hippocampus is affected by stress, it doesn't have the ability to process memories correctly. So what it does is it inhibits memory formation. So people actually don't remember things, parts of things that happen to them, information like they might be getting in school or at work. They struggle with their memory working correctly because of the activation of the system that is responding to the trauma, and it's pulling the hippocampus offline and not allowing it to do its job well. And the hippocampus also affects the ability to cope with stress. So we need that to be working correctly so that we remember things correctly, so that we file it away in long-term memory. So later, those memories are not just sitting there on the surface and present all the time, re-triggering us and re-triggering our body, but that trauma and stress makes that much harder to do. Any questions in the Q&A? Let me just check. Oh, nothing so far. Okay.
No.
All right. Is there one?
No, I'm sorry. I was saying no, there aren't any.
All right. Thank you. All right. So one other big thing that happens during adolescence that we don't talk about with brain development, but is really important, is there is an increased activation in the reward system of the brain for adolescents. This is probably the most important part of brain development that never gets talked about. So because that dopamine level that I talked about, dopamine is a feel-good chemical. It binds with things that make you feel good, whether they're external, like substances or alcohol, or internal, like endorphins. It makes you feel good, right? The dopamine is going to activate that and make you feel really good. So because that dopamine is dysregulated and dropped during adolescence, it increases impulsiveness because kids and young adults want to do things to make themselves feel good, and it has to be riskier and more dangerous than it was before, right? When you were 10, you could play in the park all day and play on the same equipment with the same toys with the same people, and that was exciting. But when you're 16, it's not the same anymore, right? You have to do more in order to have fun. And so that's because of that dysregulation in the reward system. It also causes increased susceptibility to addiction because dopamine binds with those substances and actually create the high or the euphoria that you get from drinking or from drugs. And so when you use substances in these age groups, you actually increase your potential to have addiction. There's also biological and genetic factors that are associated, but this is one internal factor. Adolescents and young adults have something called hyperrationality. It's a way of thinking that allows them to focus on things that feel good and they want to do, but actually not have a lot of capacity to focus on things they don't want to do. So they remember, all the parts of the game that they've been playing for 3 years, but they can't remember that every Wednesday is garbage night. So that's that hyperrational thinking where they focus on things that feel good and ignite that dopamine. They also have increased risk-taking and sensation-seeking because that ignites the dopamine. They have intensity of emotions, particularly big emotions like anger and love. So this is usually where people fall in love for the first time in their lives. And it's also where people experience a lot of anger, like sort of those ups and downs. And then this shift in the reward system is responsible for a shift in motivation. So we're going from external motivation, a parent saying, you need to clean your room, you need to do your homework, you need to eat, you need to do these things because a child wouldn't do them on their own. We have to require them to, and then they start to integrate it and do it on their own. That integration of doing it on their own is happening during this time. And so if it isn't consistent and it isn't supportive and the young person doesn't develop this, they often don't internalize it. And so this is where we get to young adults who struggle to stay housed or to stay employed or to, stay in a relationship. It's because they didn't internalize that internal motivation to do things that they need to do, right? Not just the things that they want to do, but the things that they need to do. Go to work, get paid, pay your bills, those kinds of things that we wouldn't otherwise also choose to do if we didn't have to do them. All right, so other risks, there are other things that put us at risk. Individually, history of violent victimization. That's the number one thing that puts you at risk for violence in the future, is being the victim of violence in your past. Attention deficit hyperactivity or learning disorders, not because there's something endemic to having those disorders. People can live healthy, happy, functional lives, go on to do many great things. It's just, it also affects the frontal lobe. And so you have some added challenges with impulsivity and decision-making that can sometimes put you at more risk. History of early aggressive behaviors, because that probably means that we have some undiagnosed or underlying issue. Early use of drugs, alcohol, or tobacco, because you're more susceptible to addiction at this age, that's probably going to be enduring for people. Poor behavioral control. So especially if it's not corrected and treated, this young person is not learning to regulate their brain, to regulate their behavior. And so that doesn't get better without assistance, it gets worse. Deficits in social, cognitive, or informational processing abilities. So trauma can actually affect the way a person learns, takes in information, is able to process information, and that feeds decision-making, weighing consequences, making good, positive decisions. And so that can be damaged, and without intervention, it can really harm them later. High emotional distress or dysregulation, so those emotions flowing back and forth. Antisocial beliefs or attitudes, particularly when they're passed down in a family. And remember, we talked about how sometimes the family are passing those down because of the things that have happened to them. Exposure to violence and conflict in the family. The family has a huge impact on us because we spend so much time with our family. From the moment we are born until we start leaving the home more, we're spending the majority of our time around family members. So they have a huge amount of exposure and influence on us. High stress factors in family, things that continue and activate those families. And then this is really important because we're going to talk about this in the equation, access to weapons. Then for the family, some of the risk factors that we see: authoritarian child rearing attitudes, so very black and white thinking without much explanation, room for children to make mistakes and recover from them. Those kids typically don't learn how to make mistakes and recover. They learn how to avoid getting in trouble, but not how to recover from a mistake and change behavior. Harsh, lax or inconsistent disciplinary practices, just as damaging when they don't have the guidelines, the rules, or the support to guide them in making mistakes and recovering from them. Low parental involvement for lots of reasons. Low emotional attachment to a parent or caregiver. And this can be from that generational trauma. Maybe that parent didn't get love or the support that they needed, and they don't have it to give. They don't have those skills or those tools to use in their own parenting. Low parental education or income. And I've asterisked this because poverty is not trauma and violence. You can be poor and you can be protected and loved, but the things that come along with low parental education and income can exacerbate trauma. So like not having access to treatment and intervention, not having access to stable housing and food and income, those things that come from having dysregulated income and usually fed by lower education is the problem, not the fact of being poor. Poor people do not innately have some propensity towards violence. It's the things that they don't have access to or they can't get that they need that contribute to violence. Poor family functioning and poor monitoring and supervision of children. So these are big risk factors for our family. I've added a little bit about community risk factors because it's really important that where you live denotes how much risk you're at for violence. So diminished economic opportunities, high concentrations of poor residents, high levels of transiency, high levels of family disruption, low levels of community participation, socially disorganized neighborhoods, and I would also add violence. Really contributes to your risk for violence. If you go home and your home is not a safe sanctuary and you hear gunshots and sirens and there's activity on your street and to walk to school, you have to walk by people being harmed or people hurt, your body is going to activate to that differently than someone that didn't have that experience getting to math class.
Gina, one question
Yes.
in the Q&A. Someone wants to know, is there any research regarding violent video games or sports?
There's some mixed research around simply watching violence. It does not appear to have a huge impact on kids that otherwise would not be prone to violence. But if you have someone who has many of the risk factors that we've talked about, they've experienced their own violence, they grow up in a house with dysfunction, they're continually have access to violence in real life and in some other format like video or TV, it could exacerbate it. But just watching violent videos does not cause violence. Most research is mixed about that. It's not conclusive to say that that's a factor. Great question. All right, so let's talk about static and dynamic factors. So I ran a program at the district attorney's office in San Francisco called the sentencing planning program, where we looked at 18 to 24-year-olds who were involved in the criminal justice system. And we did a trauma assessment with them, a risk assessment with them, to understand what was happening before they got involved in the system and what kinds of things could change or not change. And so, what we found were there were two categories. There are static factors, things that happen to them that we can't control, we can't change. They were exposed to violence. Their family had instability or dysfunction. They experienced trauma. There was family violence. There was abuse, neglect, sexual abuse. We can't change those things. Those have happened in the past. And unfortunately, they didn't get addressed or treated or safety reconnected for that young person. So now they are not just huge risk factors, but they kind of feed the behavior that we see. But the second category is the dynamic factor. These are things that are happening right now in the present that we could do something about. So if they present with anger, emotional dysregulation, poor coping skills, cognitive distortions in their thinking, right? Like, I can't trust anyone, or, the system's never going to let me have a regular job, or I can't make it unless I'm doing something that's illegal. Lack of insight. So even the capacity to understand how bad things are for them. And sometimes this is organic. We have substance abuse issues and mental health issues that actually called something called, oh God, now I can't remember what it is. Well, I'll think of it in a moment. That causes you to not have insight about how bad things are. If you've ever had a loved one that was addicted to substances and you're telling them how worried you are for them, and they're not feeling worried, or they're telling you that they're fine and they don't need you to worry about them, that's anosognosia, is the process of not having insight into actually what's happening to you at the time. And drugs will mask that insight and not allow you to see that clearly. And then we have antisocial and negative attitudes, and we know some of those come out of generational trauma. And then add that with impulsivity, both prone and heightened at this age, and then also a result of the trauma. These are the pieces, these dynamic pieces are the things that we can treat. We actually have strategies to make this better if the person is willing to engage with them and we have access to it for them. All right, let's talk about understanding violence. And I'm going to go a little bit quicker because I want to make sure we have time for prosecution. So what is violence? What causes it? There's biological things that cause it, neurological, physiological, chemical influences. So we know that changes in dopamine, we know that changes in some of the chemicals that cause aggression are really present when someone is violent. We have social factors, things like rules, attitudes, values, and norms that people learn, mostly out of their trauma, mostly out of bad experiences, either in their family or things that have happened to them, that cause them to have social rules that make them more aggressive and more violent. Things like, I can't trust anyone by myself. No one else is going to take care of me for me. I have to be there for me. I can't worry about other people. I don't care about other people's things. Those are values that come out of trauma. There's also cognitive issues, ideas, beliefs, and patterns and thinkings that are hostile and give attribution bias, right? They put the blame on things because they've had an associated connection between it, but it may not be the whole story or the whole reason something happens, right? Like whether those are attitudes about education, employment, housing, law enforcement, mostly about the systems that have let them down, and they don't trust those systems anymore, and now they won't access them for services. And then the last one is situational stress, things that just make it harder for people at different times, like aggression from other people, having to protect yourself, having to keep yourself safe in a really tough, dangerous environment. Aversive situations, things that are bad, plus having access to guns and weapons. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. So what drives violence? So this is the great equation. This is really what drives violence. It's pain. So that trauma that we've been talking about, whether it was your own trauma or generational trauma or long-lasting trauma, plus your age, so adolescent and young adulthood, that time where your capacity to be impulsive is heightened, your decision-making is still solidifying, your memory is affected, your emotions are heightened, plus weapons, right? So the weapons is what makes this deadly. The weapon is what goes from an angry adolescent maybe fighting to an angry adolescent or young adult killing someone. It's the access to the weapons. We have taken things that we've known for centuries about human beings, the trauma and the developmental stage, and we've added a weapon that can kill people. And because of that, we have more violence. Is violence addictive? It actually works on that exact same reward center part of the brain. So not all emotions associated with violence are negative. Actually, some of them are positive. Like when you protect yourself with someone with violence, that's positive, right? The outcome of it is positive. You didn't get hurt. Or when you get revenge on someone who has harmed you with violence, that could be a positive feeling, right? In the long run, it's not a positive thing, but it actually feels good. It solves the problem. It protects you. So because there are positive emotions that are also associated with violence, it activates that same reward center in our brain that's associated with other addictions and is also sort of in flux when this person is a young adult or an adolescent. Aggression is rewarded by positive feelings of power and dominance, revenge, or protecting yourself. And so that's a really important, powerful feeling. And remember that those feelings are even more heightened during this age group from adolescence and young adulthood. It's why we see more criminal activity during this age group. All right, so what do? Treating violence and public safety. I propose we have a paradigm shift. This is my big thinking and what I want to do to change the world. Instead of generational trauma, we should be thinking about generational health. We need primary prevention from violence. So when we know violence is happening, harm, children are being abused, they're being neglected, somebody is sexually abusing them or harming them in some way, we need immediate intervention and get that child to safety and help that child recover so that we limit the amount of impact it has on their further development and their future behavior. Second, we need early detection and treatment for kids that have experienced violence and are now impacted by it. So they're already struggling in school, or they're already struggling with health issues like, asthma and pre-diabetes and other things. How do we intervene significantly to help stop the damage that's being caused and prevent that child from getting worse and having to engage in the behaviors that are a result of that trauma? And then the third layer, the tertiary layer, is to provide intervention, accountability, and treatment when someone is already exhibiting behaviors where they are either harming themselves or other people. And so we can't just detain young children without treatment because nothing will change for them. The damage has already begun. And without intervention and treatment, that damage won't heal on its own. It has to have support. Something has to change for that young person for them to get better. So once we get to the place where harm has been caused to them or to other people, the treatment is critical to stop that kind of violence. All right, so what are some things that we also have to do? I say instead of those adverse childhood experiences, we invest heavily in positive childhood adolescent experiences. So access to mental health care across the developmental span from birth through, young adulthood. We have early intervention and treatment for abuse and trauma, and that it's accessible to people at all levels, just as accessible as healthcare. We have pregnancy health and mental health care because trauma can be transmitted during pregnancy. When a mother is struggling to carry a child, to bring a child into the world, to parent children, that needs to be supported. Services and resources for 0 to 5. We have some really good foundations for that. Pre-K education, 1, because it provides a foundation for learning, but 2, it provides a foundation for safety. Well-funded schools with a variety of options and services and resources, after school and activities that include things that help children to grow, like sports, arts, music, theater, academics, and service, paid job training opportunities. And then we need options for young adults, things that keep them safe and hold them as they continue to develop and their brain continues to integrate. So college, trade schools, military, opportunities for training, things that we used to have in place that kind of held young adults as they continue to grow. They have capacity. They have full brain capacity. They're just learning to integrate it and use it together differently. All right, that's it for the trauma side. Now we're up for Arcelia.
Thank you so much, Gina. Thank you so much, Gina. My name is Arcelia Hurtado. I'm the Director of Policy and Training for the Prosecutors Alliance, and happy to be here with you all. I am formerly the Director of Training at the San Francisco District Attorney's Office. So I am going to talk a little bit about the role of the prosecutor in preventing violence, particularly violence related to an individual risk factor that Gina talked about, which is access to weapons, more specifically guns. Next slide, please. So as you're probably all aware, there's over 4.2 million Californians who own guns, or 1 in 7 people in the state of California, and 25% of the population live in a house with a gun. So these are staggering statistics, which I'm sure maybe you've heard. Next slide, please. And we also know that guns killed more than 45,000 people in the US in 2020, and it is the #1 leading cause of death for children in the US. And also that the majority, 55.9% of intimate partner homicides are committed with guns. So what these statistics show you is that gun ownership and possession is prevalent in California and in the US. For example, the Armed Prohibited Persons database in California has 24,000 names on it. And these are people who legally purchased a gun but lost their Second Amendment right to own a gun due to criminal convictions, mental illness, or other court-ordered exclusions. But we have largely failed to ensure that the people on that list indeed have surrendered their guns and have no access to them. Next slide, please. So I want to talk about one mechanism that we can use to prevent gun violence by tackling that individual risk factor of access to weapons. And these are called gun violence restraining orders. So what is a civil gun violence restraining order, also known as a red flag law? What is a civil gun violence restraining order? If you are afraid someone close to you may use a gun to hurt themselves or another person, you can seek a civil gun violence restraining order. It works by restricting possession and use of guns before anyone gets hurt. So a gun violence restraining order is a court order that prohibits someone from having a gun, ammunition, or magazines. It can order someone to not have, possess, or own a gun, ammunition, or magazines, not buy those items, and turn in any guns, ammunition, and magazines to the police, sell them to, or store them with a licensed gun dealer. And I want to note that the San Diego City Attorney's Office has successfully used GVROs through a coordinated effort since December of 2017 in conjunction with the San Diego Police Department and the San Diego Superior Court, where they file these civil restraining orders as soon as the police department receives information that they then bring to the city attorney that someone poses a significant danger to themselves or to others. And used in this way, GVROs serve as a preventative measure to avoid gun violence, often before a criminal case has come to fruition. And these are some examples of cases where they have obtained GVROs. For example, a 23-year-old ex-Marine who had developed a paranoia that all males wanted to harm him. He had walked into an auto parts store with a loaded handgun, but called police before shooting anyone. There was also a case of a 39-year-old man who, while intoxicated at 3 times the legal limit, believed he was shooting at raccoons and rats in his backyard, and terrified neighbors called police as bullets flew into their backyards. And finally, there was a case of an 81-year-old man who threatened to shoot his 75-year-old wife and a neighbor because he believed they were having an affair. His wife escaped the house barefoot by climbing a fence and was able to get away, but his family reported him to be in the early stages of dementia. So there was a restraining order that was obtained to protect the family. So since the program's launch in San Diego in December of 2017, they have removed more than 1,600 firearms, including 50 assault weapons from 865 people who either threatened suicide or violence against coworkers, classmates, an intimate partner, a family member, or the general public. Next slide, please. So who can ask for a gun violence restraining order? Well, here you see listed on this slide the people who may petition for a GVRO. To qualify as a close family member, you must have one of these relationships with the person who may cause harm to self or others. So here you see listed who can petition. A roommate is also qualified to petition. Employer or coworker of the person who may use a gun. An employee or teacher of certain schools, and of course, a law enforcement officer. Next slide. So what do you have to prove to get one of these gun violence restraining orders? You will need to give facts to the judge that would convince him or her of all of the following: that the person you want to restrain owns or is trying to get guns, the person poses a significant danger now or in the future of personal injury to themselves or to another person, and you need a restraining order because another less restrictive way to protect against the danger will not work or has been tried but did not work or is not appropriate. Next slide. So how long is the restraining order in effect? So there's also a type of restraining order called a temporary or emergency gun violence restraining order, and that one lasts about 21 days. This is a type of restraining order that law enforcement can request if they have information that someone is in danger of harming themselves or others. It's an order issued by the court immediately. To have a longer restraining order, up to 5 years, there has to be a court hearing, and at that court hearing, the judge will consider all the evidence and decide whether to approve the restraining order. Next slide. So that is one example of how prosecutors can use the existing law to prevent violence with guns before it harms people. I want to leave you with some additional resources. We don't have time to go in depth into all the different kinds of restraining orders, but I want to leave you with some additional resources if you're interested in finding out more about how gun laws operate in California. There is an organization, Cal Matters, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit news organization that did an in-depth series recently that is a good overview of the flaws in California laws and efforts to regulate illegal gun use. I recommend reading that to get an overview of the state's efforts to date and to get an idea of the holes that currently exist in enforcement. It helps to explain why, even though California has the toughest gun laws in the country, the state has done a terrible job of getting prohibited guns off the streets. Next slide, please. There's also SB 320, which became law on October 8, 2021. And it's a recent legislative effort to address some of the shortcomings and gaps in current law. Among other things, SB 320 amended current law to clarify procedures for relinquishing firearms, including providing a receipt to the court that the firearm has been relinquished in an approved manner. It also requires every local court to provide information on how prohibited people can comply with firearms relinquishment. So in other words, it tells people how they can comply with the law and give up their guns after they've been ordered to do so. And finally, in domestic violence proceedings, it requires courts to act on information received that a restrained person has access to or possession of a gun, and also to take that info into consideration in making custody and other family law determinations. Next slide, please. And finally, the Giffords Center, and I apologize for this slide. I know you cannot read it, it's too small, but I wanted to make you aware that the Giffords Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence put together a very handy chart, which we will send out with the materials for this training. It's entitled Civil Restraining Orders in California, and it summarizes all of the various types of restraining orders that apply to potentially restrict gun possession, including domestic violence emergency protective orders, the 2 restraining orders that we talked about a second ago, the emergency gun violence restraining order, which is in effect for up to 21 days, and the gun violence restraining order, which is in effect for between 1 to 5 years after a hearing. It also discusses domestic violence restraining orders, elder or dependent abuse restraining orders, civil harassment restraining orders, and workplace violence and school violence prevention orders. So I encourage you to study that chart and contact Julia Weber at the Giffords Center with any questions. It's a very handy chart if you're trying to figure out what various types of restraining orders can curb access to guns. And Julia, of course, is an incredible resource regarding all things having to do with the law applicable to guns in California. So with that, I know we are running short on time, so I'll turn it back over to Gina to close this out and take any questions you may have. I see some, let's see, some questions in the Q&A. Let's see. How long does a civil GVRO compare to a 5-year criminal protective order? So again, the emergency one is up to 21 days, and the civil GVRO is up to 5 years. So it depends on the circumstances, of course. And I believe so it can vary between 1 and 5 years depending on the circumstances. So they're similar. However, the difference is that the civil GVRO can be initiated by non-law enforcement. So like the list of people that I mentioned, roommates, co-workers, people who have a fear that someone may pose a reasonable danger, may pose a danger to themselves or to others, have a reasonable fear that they pose a danger to themselves or others. Okay, I hope that answered that question.
There's a question about the slides. Yes, you will get a copy of the slides on Friday. If you fill out the evaluation that you're going to get, you'll get an evaluation first, and then on Friday, the slides and other materials will go out to everyone. Just check any other questions. Okay. All right. So we just want to end with this quote: hurt people, but healed people, heal people. Preventing violence is really the solution. Removing weapons from people that, cannot use them in a safe way or are going to harm other people. Intervening when people have experienced trauma early on so that they don't develop the capacity to be violent. Interrupting violence when it's occurring to try to curb it and stop it. We can't bring people back. We can prevent harm from happening. And that's what this is really about, is knowing that these are ties to pain that have happened to people, along with other factors we've talked about today, and that there are things we can do to prevent fatalities from happening. These are some references for the presentation today. And again, if you haven't already signed up, please sign up for our last training day of the year. It's going to be December 5th. We're going to repeat 4 different trainings: the victims' rights training, the stalking training, California victims compensation, and neurobiology of sexual trauma. When you get this presentation on Friday, you'll be able to click to register, but you can also point your camera at the QR code and register now for this training. And then here's contact information for Arcelia and I with the Prosecutors Alliance. Thank you all for being here today and for being part of our training series.
Thank you so much. Have a good evening, everyone. I was not able to answer some questions in the chat for some reason.
Yeah, we could try to answer them when we send out the materials too.
Yeah.
I'm just reading through some of those now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Arcelia.
Yes, thank you, Gina.
Have a nice night.